Hi, and welcome to Faculty Focus, a podcast supporting the clinical education community in Leicester. We bring you Educator CPD, showcase new initiatives, and shine a light on some of the faculty behind it all.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Faculty Focus podcast. I'm Andrew Hughes and I'm joined by one of my colleagues in anaesthetics, and we're going to be talking about the AMEE 2025 conference, which was held in Barcelona. So hopefully some regular listeners will know that the podcast we did for the AMEE 2024 podcast got sort of lost in the recording software and it was released quite late. So we're hoping to not do that this time and get it out within a few months of the conference. So AMEE 2025, Dave, would you like to introduce who you are and we can talk a little bit about Barcelona?
Hello, everybody. I'm David Marriott. I'm one of the children's anaesthetists at Leicester Royal Infirmary. I also work with Andy in the medical education role in ITAPS. And this was my second AMEE conference I've been to. Yes, and as Andy says, it was in the lovely city of Barcelona. What did you think of Barcelona, Andy?
Hot, very hot. Sort of conference where you're sort of thinking, can I wear shorts to the conference or do I have to wear something more smart? I'm not sure. Can't remember what I did wear in the end, but yeah, it's a hot place. It's in the middle of summer.
The last day, I think. We dared it for the last day.
Yes, yeah. So once we found our feet. Lovely place. I have to say, AMEE in Barcelona was actually the first conference I went to many years ago. I can't remember when it was now, but it was my first AMEE conference as one of the education fellows. And so, yeah, it was nice to go back as a consultant and actually to go back, with yourselves, and obviously your wife Zoe came as well. So we sort of enjoyed a little bit of tapas and walking around some of the old town. That was a bit of Barcelona I've never really seen before, because the first time I was there, I just wanted to be all things med ed, so didn't really get to see anything about Barcelona. But you've been a few times, I think, or once before at least.
This is my second time. We went for weekend away many, many years ago. And yeah, I mean, Barcelona is huge, isn't it? It's got all that Gothic quarter with all the beautiful sort of Gothic architecture. We went and had a quick look at the Sagrada Familia from the outside.
Right.
Couldn't get tickets to go in, unfortunately, because it gets sold out early. So top tip for listeners, if you're ever going back, book them about a week in advance.
Yes.
And Zoe came with us as well. So we had a bit of an explore of the city while we were busy being educated about education.
Indeed, yeah. I was thinking these sort of conferences do have to be held in the sort of big city locations around Europe because it is such a big conference. Those that haven't been or don't know, AMEE is the Association for Medical Education in Europe. It's one of the biggest medical education organisations, or certainly one of the biggest conferences on the topic. And it is held every year in August, the bank holiday weekend. It tends to rotate through, I've seen, there's probably about 7 or 8 cities it seems to be rotating between. So yeah, it was a packed conference as per usual. There are up to 26, 27 parallel streams for each time slot in the conference, apart from the plenaries where everyone goes to the main auditorium. There are lots of different streams. There are lots of different themes to all those different streams. So you can really find something for whatever you're doing in medical education, whether it's more management or simulation or undergraduate, postgraduate assessment. There's pretty much everything there. So you do have to sort of look through this huge abstract booklet, or the app makes it a lot easier actually to filter through the stuff that you want. So yeah, you do need to do a bit of planning before you get into it, before you arrive. Otherwise you can be a little bit overwhelmed.
I messed that up in the last AMEE conference and going to a lot of frustrating sessions that weren't really relevant. But we did a better job this time, I think. It was a lot more useful.
I think so. So where do you want to start off? Was there any sort of, what's the sort of top takeaway that you came across at the conference?
I think there were 2 main areas. There was the error-based session that you've talked about a lot before when we've had discussions, and also then the sort of feedback and debriefing. The other thing that will be worth mentioning today is the ongoing AI tale, I think. Can come towards that at the end of things. The feedback and debriefing one I went to on the third day, and I think it was just sort of permeated throughout the whole conference as well, which was really quite nice. There was the normal sort of talk about, how to do sort of feedback ideas and debriefing. And in the session that I went to, they had the 3 different areas. So they had feedback, debriefing, and coaching experts talking. And they set it out as a market stall, they described it as. Each person had 5 minutes to sort of sell their method and how it was different and what the benefits were. And then they came together as a group, really, and then spent the next half an hour pointing out that they're all very similar and have very similar ideas between the 2 of them. But again, the differences also came out as well. One of the big things I took from that was a thing called situational safety, which is an idea that we've often had when we've done simulation, and I try and bring into other people that do sims about this is not an exam. this is not a test. Actually, this is an area that you can experiment in, that you can learn in, and that you can make errors in unusual situations safely and therefore learn about them in the debriefing afterwards. And I thought that was a really interesting sort of way of thinking about it. And a phrase as in, situational safety. It's something that I think most of us that do a lot of sim and experience sim understand. To actually put a name on it was quite nice.
Yeah. I mean, the panel was really big hitters, wasn't it, from the field of feedback and debrief. So there's some really big name, really credible panel that we were listening to. And yeah, that safety thing was sort of a well-attended session as well, wasn't it? You can tell that it's one of these topics that everybody is interested on how to do it better, how to make it less painful. So everyone's sort of looking for the magic trick in feedback. But yeah, I think the idea of sort of safety, there was a comment around learning isn't meant to be comfortable and it isn't meant to be easy. So the one thing I took from that was try not to disguise feedback. So if there's something you need to address it and not sort of try and package it into something that's comfortable, because learning and improving isn't comfortable. So that was sort of one comment that came from one of those speakers. Yeah, sorry, go on. I interrupted you, Dave.
No, that's okay. There was also a little chat in that feedback debriefing session about it being a spectrum. And of course, you probably know that most things are spectrums, definitely in clinical medicine, but also in medical education. And the idea that there's a spectrum between feedback, debriefing, and coaching, and that feedback is probably the more of the facilitator lead. As you say, there's something uncomfortable, it needs to be brought up, you need to explicitly mention it. Towards the other end, coaching is actually almost facilitator-less. You're enabling the person to find their own learning outcomes and learning expression. Well, that was a really good way of looking at it, with debrief being in the middle. It's sort of half feedback and it's sort of half facilitator run and developed, but also we've both done lots of debriefing stuff where you allow the learner to facilitate their own learning. So it becomes more of a coaching style. Well, that was a nice way that session sort of ended with this idea that actually it's a spectrum rather than a sort of linear, we're now doing feedback, we're now doing a debrief, we're now doing a coaching. And you can move between the two.
I think that's quite important to think about, isn't it? Because you can sometimes think, right, well, I'm going to be having this type of conversation, and then you stick too rigidly to what you think the conversation should be, then it becomes a bit disingenuous, doesn't it? So it was almost permission to move between where the control is in that conversation to make it more of a genuine, learning conversation. Yeah, I like that.
I feel models sometimes are too strict and too rigid. Actually, you can move between the different models. So I thought that was really nice. And as you say, there were some big hitters there who were sort of talking about this amongst themselves. So that was nice sort of reinforcement of future practice, I think.
Yeah. One of the speakers spoke about what are your motivations going into that conversation? So sometimes we can be really frustrated and we want to use that conversation as a way of straightening things out, almost in a punitive way. You might go in, I need to have this conversation, but if you just take a moment to think, why am I having this? Is this more for me or is this more for my learner that's in front of me? Just a little bit of reflection just to make sure that actually you should be having this conversation because it's about the learner growing into a better practitioner or a better clinician. That's something I hadn't really appreciated before, because sometimes the emotion sort of sort of pushes you towards a type of conversation or a tone in your conversation that maybe isn't that helpful for the learner. So yeah, there were little nuggets in there. I think the general principles were, keeping it learner-led, keeping it that safety element in there. And one of the big ways of sharing or making something safe is sort of sharing that vulnerability from you as an observer, is sort of trying to understand and trying to empathize with somebody who was in that position. To say that, that's something maybe you've gone through or you found difficult, or appreciating the pressure of the situation is all goes into creating that safe environment for you to have that honest conversation. There was a speaker at the end talked about a particular model. I think she developed a talk debrief tool. Is that something you'd come across before? Have you sort of used that in your practice?
I do a few teaching sessions on how to debrief and trying to, open people's eyes to rather than the compliment sandwich, which is a firm favourite, shouldn't be. I hadn't actually heard of the talk debrief tool, which is something that I'm going to need to look up a little bit more on, and be honest, I haven't at the moment.
Yeah. I think it was something she developed through her own research, so I'm not sure how widely used it is just yet. But yeah, we can put the link into the show notes if anyone's interested on reading up about that. I think it felt like it sort of fell into the sort of TRIM, the TRIM debrief. So what does that stand for again?
Trauma something immediate management.
Right. And that's something that is offered locally within the trust. So if your teams have gone through something quite difficult, that's something you can arrange for your team through there's a trim management or trim debrief email within the trust you can search for on the intranet. So that's worth bearing in mind. So yeah, it was kind of along those sorts of lines. But yeah, stick that into the show notes.
The talk tool actually has a foundation behind it as well that's promoting good debriefing. That's worth looking at. It's talkdebrief.org.
Talkdebrief.org. Yeah, that's the one. So we'll stick that into the notes. Good. Yeah. So that was nice to go to. Nice to see that most of certainly what we already had an idea about when it came to debrief and feedback is kind of still current, but also some little extra bits to explore beyond what we already know. I thought that was pitched really well. It was a really well delivered session, actually, in a kind of a panel interview discussion type of format, which was good.
In these academic conferences, to get lost as a clinician and feel that you are being talked to by the academics. So those sessions are really valuable because they sort of just firm up and sort of coalesce into a better idea what you've maybe already been thinking or experiencing. So it's nice to see that the academic world reflects the clinical world as well, because it can sometimes feel like it's not very applicable. But
yeah, yes, it can get a bit too theoretical, can't it, at some of the sessions? Great. Well, I'd like to talk about error-based learning.
of course you would.
Yeah, Dave will know very well. Ever since from last year's conference in Basel, 2024, I came back and I was just talking about adaptive expertise, and it was about making sure how can we encourage the training of our residents to become adaptive experts, not just procedural experts. And so I've been talking a lot about that. And as it happened, on our way back from dinner one night, and we were on the metro system, and we realised we were on the wrong platform. We had to go to the other platform. And as we were walking to the other platform, someone overheard us and said, "Oh, actually, that's where I'm going. Does this go north or south?" Turned out I had to double take, and I thought, I recognise this person. Turns out it was one of the speakers from AMEE 2024 that talked about adaptive expertise. It was quite a nice moment. So Naomi Steenhoff, she's a clinical pharmacist professor in Canada. She talked about adaptive expertise, and it turned out the next day she was doing a joint delivered session on error-based learning and how we leverage errors to enhance the learning we give in healthcare professions education. So that was great because it signposted that session. I think you already had it in your schedule. So we both went along to that. And yeah, so it moves to this. The idea is that error-based learning is similar to other types of learning that we already do. It fits very well into the feedback and debriefing in the sort of an immediate clinical environment where you're providing feedback and talking about when things go wrong and could have gone better. So it sort of aligns quite nicely with the sort of feedback and debrief as well. But the idea is that actually errors are quite a powerful motivator to learning, but you need to manage those situations quite carefully. And again, we come back to this idea of feeling safe and having the safety to not let that error, when someone makes an error, not let that totally overcast everything else about that situation, because out of every error, there's loads of learning to be had. So there was a lot of talk about making sure you get the level of error right, that you make a situation as safe as possible before the error. So that all comes down to sort of your general rapport with somebody if you're working with them or you're training them. From session to session, it might be just one session with them, but it could be for several weeks or months. But you also need to have a good pre-brief before that session. So maybe sharing some of your own failures, maybe saying that it's okay not to get things completely perfect first time or completely perfect after the fifth or sixth time, that life's quite messy, learning can be a bit clunky, but the idea is ultimately we're moving towards mastery. And so what we don't want is people feeling massive amount of guilt or shame when they come to these errors. And if they do, that then becomes a real barrier to the learning from errors. So this idea of, you made the right decision, but the outcome didn't turn out how you wanted it to, that's not necessarily an error. It's just that sometimes you do all the right things and the bad thing happens. But also making sure that people are aware of some of the errors that they've made, so they sometimes don't always notice the errors they've made, because you can get away with it. Sometimes you can not do the best thing and it still have a good outcome. So it works both ways. So making sure you're looking out for those in the clinical environment. But it's an interesting one, and it's just got me thinking about how you might implement that within a department. So how do you bring people around to this idea that errors are a valuable learning opportunity, given that we work with patients and real people? So when you still talk about errors, we're all talking about trying to avoid errors. Naturally, in healthcare, it's all about avoiding errors, making things safer. But it's a spectrum, and some errors you definitely do want to avoid, but other errors are like procedural. They don't have massively detrimental outcomes, but they need to happen. And I think one of the questions that someone from the audience sent was exactly on that. Was Well, what if it was your child who was having this method of learning being looked after by anaesthetists or surgeons, for example, in theatre? Would you be comfortable with that? That they're training in this manner, but that's your child having their operation. And that's a very personal question. It kind of got quite real at that point. I think the argument is that long term, would you rather someone make an error and be picked up on it and discussed it, have a discussion around it and find a way forward with expert practitioners around them? Or would you rather they don't have that opportunity and potentially make that mistake on their own or not even notice down the line once they've moved on from their training? Which I thought was quite a sort of powerful question, but also quite a powerful answer, because clearly you want to pick that stuff up before someone gets signed off and off they go as a completely independent practitioner.
I think that speaks to the problems we have in clinical education every day, is how do you allow those errors to happen, and how do you pick up on them and teach to them? And as you say, it's a difficult question. If it was your child having this method of learning, how would you feel about it? But the way that I often look at it is that those errors are going to happen. We're not inducing error. We're not, swapping drugs or making the machine not function.
So yeah,
We're not deliberately inducing errors. We are hopefully, as educators, picking up on those errors and using those as learning opportunities. And
yeah,
I think that's a really valuable way of looking at it, in that if an error occurs, something has happened to the patient, whether or not there's a negative outcome. It's our job, therefore, to pick up on those errors and enable the learners to learn from them, again, in a psychologically safe, coming back to that phrase, way. That means that they don't happen again in future. I think that's really sort of critical idea in clinical education, that, human error, there's going to be humans, there's going to be errors. It's really part of the job is to pick up on those and learn from them and prevent them in future. I think it's very interesting in that way. And like you say, that question, I think, made the whole room sort of sit back and think. That'll be my general approach to it, really, that, we've got to pick it up and we've got to learn.
yeah, that's it. There's quite a lot of pressure on the supervisor in those situations, and that was something she tackled. Naomi had the part of the session. She tackled that head on and said, sometimes that we don't always have the mental capacity to do training in this way because we've got lots of other pressures on us. So sometimes it may not be it's not a case of this is how we should be teaching everyone all the time. It's, making sure that when those moments happen, we can use that as a learning opportunity. There is a lot of pressure in supervisors, particularly when you're teaching, well, in any format, is to certainly sort of have this belief that there's a pressure to always role model perfection in everything that you do, whether it's clinical or whether it's teaching. You should be the role model you're the consultant, you're the expert. But that in itself, one, it's a pressure that can not paralyze you, but it can definitely stop you being as free as you should be and adaptable. You feel it can sort of impact on your credibility, but it's how you manage that. So when things aren't perfect and you are leading the list or you're leading the clinic and the consultation hasn't maybe gone perfectly, it's using that as a learning opportunity and saying, this is what I mean, is that it isn't always perfect. It doesn't always go to plan, but this is how we can recover and get the best outcome we can in the situation. So taking the pressure off yourself, not feeling like you have to be perfect, and maybe sort of having thresholds for intervention, being really open about this is when we're going to step in and I'll take control or I'll get some extra help, so that it's not a kind of surprise when things start to move off and just need a little bit more control being applied. It's not a criticism of someone's individual abilities. That was quite good. But there is a lot out there on error-based learning, and at the end they gave us sort of a link to a drive with lots of sort of current papers on that. But I think it is an area that we will probably come back to, something that we may look at trying to discuss within our department. So if you are interested, then do get in touch and we can certainly dig out those papers for you and let you have a read about how people have implemented it, what learners' experiences are of that, and some of the kind of evidence base behind that, because it does feed into what we already know about effective learning, and that is the struggle, the fail, that makes for much more effective long-term learning. So let us know. You mentioned AI. So elephant in the room, well, not so much elephant in the room, but every conference has got an AI element, I'm sure, in recent years.
Went to a paediatric meeting on Friday and there was an...
Yeah. Yeah, what do you tell me what your thoughts were on the AI aspect?
We had quite a wide-ranging talk about AI, didn't we, over the sort of 3 days, and it felt like the conference, if you were going to put a theme on the conference, and all these conferences sort of have the themes that they advertise, but I think AI was the underlying sort of current for most of the sessions. I mean, there probably wasn't a session where it wasn't mentioned at least once in passing, even if it was referred to as machine learning rather than, or large language model, rather than AI. there was a lot of talk about it and how you could use the tools. Felt the overwhelming feeling was that it's being used by students a lot already, and there does seem to be evidence that it's cropping up more and more in essay writing and sort of formalised things. And then the question always becomes, how do we respond to that? And do we, we accept that AI is coming and it's going to stay, and that actually it should be integrated into things? And there was some discussions about how you can use AI to generate curricula and sort of problem solve your curricula and look at, are things matching up, and do they match other curricula that are available on the internet? And at the end of the day, they have to be available online for the AI to process it. So there was a lot of talk about sort of concerns and considerations. There was a very interesting thing about the public, who they believe is liable if AI is used for clinical decisions. And that sort of seemed to fall down on mainly the clinician, but also the AI as well. And I understand that the AI creators then would have a big problem with that, because they didn't design these engines to be clinically, culpable. But that was just a little bit within the whole picture. Yeah, there was a lot of questions. I'm not sure we came away with a lot of answers. You feel like an evolving field, but it's evolving so fast, it might not be one that you can ever get in front of. You just sort of have to work out how you can use it in your own education, and how we respond to it in the learners, I suppose.
Yeah, I think because the other thing is that a lot of AI, as you say, it uses stuff that's open access. So if you have to use it for something quite niche, or that requires a reasonable amount of expertise in a particular area, then you might not get the detailed sort of responses that you would want. So it depends really what's out there, and sometimes the good stuff is paywalled because it's, people have spent time and energy trying to make sure that the content is, well created, is evidence-based. So you really are depending on what's on the internet. And if you think about anyone can publish anything on the internet in an open format, and so if that is your resource, some of the questions, if you're starting out in learning in a particular topic, then that's where you're vulnerable, because you don't really have the ability to sense check what you're consuming. Whereas if you've already got that expertise or some of that knowledge, you can then, the better you are at spotting that doesn't quite add up. But the blame thing, if something went wrong, was interesting. I think you mentioned what the public's expectations were. So if a clinician went against what an AI program suggested and something went wrong, who's wrong? Equally, if it was flipped, and if you did what the AI didn't suggest and everything turned out right in the end, then what? So this idea that if it goes wrong, and you went against, it's a bit like going against guidelines, isn't it? Is that the guidelines are exactly that, they are guidelines, but sometimes you have to step out because this situation is different. And we already feel uncomfortable practicing outside of guidelines. So that's just an extension to an AI program telling you, with all the information it has from, I don't know, if you open it to the whole NHS and all the patients in the UK, if it then says, well, this is the best course of action, you don't follow it, you're probably going to be in a bit of trouble. But equally, the AI doesn't take responsibility itself.
Well, that study, wasn't it, that was presented from 2020, and I just had to look at the abstract. And it was an online experiment where they took 2,000 participants, and there were 4 scenarios, and they were non-medical participants, and they were told the AI has said X, but the doctor's done Y, and the outcome is Z. And they looked at how people judged the AI and the clinician, and it was always felt that the clinician was in the wrong and directly responsible for the harm that came to the patient.
Yeah.
They rejected what the AI had said, even if that was, this is a 1 in a million problem or clinical issue, that actually the clinician's judgment is possibly better than the AI, because, as you say, it has to be online, it has to be searchable.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting then, that 2,000 members of the general public view, as you say, sort of ignoring the AI and maybe using clinical decision as a culpable thing. The legal liability still always comes down to clinician. I don't think that'll change, but public perception, as you say, could change towards the fact that we should be listening to the machine more than our, what often seems gut instinct, but actually is probably 20 plus years of experience in a field, sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's very quickly, these sort of conversations do move into, beyond medical education, beyond medicine. These conversations then sort of enter popular culture and how it will affect lots of aspects of our lives. So it's quite difficult to keep it just on the medical education. And some of the talks did sort of end up going off into the popular culture, or the mainstream view of AI. And at a MedEd conference, it was it would have been quite nice to sort of stay on that topic. I think what I was looking for is, because AI has been talked about for a couple of years now at these things, I was looking for, maybe a framework or a set of principles that might be offered to say, if you are using it or your students are using it, then here are a few points that you might want to consider to either, bring it in, mitigate it, use it to your advantage. But I didn't really get much of that. It was more of a commentary of what was kind of already out there. And like you say, each year it moves to it's another step into, where AI is now. And it's the same sort of conversations. So, yeah. Well, there were some examples of people using different AI tools out there. I went to a workshop about the Google's Notebook LM, and I think you could probably do what that does in a large language model like ChatGPT, for example. It just kind of makes it a little bit more user-friendly. So Notebook LM is where you can upload your resources, essentially the resources that you tell it to use. So you have much more control over what it's using to generate whatever it is you want. And that looked pretty impressive. And I think, for example, the session we talked about where we had a link to a Google Drive with a lot of papers in there for error-based learning, you could take a bunch of those papers, you could load it into your notebook, and then you can generate all sorts of content from it. You can generate frequently asked questions, quizzes. So if you're going to run a session, maybe you do a pre-session quiz and then a set of different questions for the end. You can create summaries, even lesson plans. So essentially anything you would ask a large language model to do on a particular topic, you could do that, but essentially target the resources. The interesting other function was that you could also create audio and video outputs. So summaries. So, it could generate a sort of a conversation between two people on the topic that you've uploaded. And it's very impressive. It sounds very natural, a very sort of podcasty type of conversation, which is completely artificially generated based on your content. So yeah, that was quite impressive. I had played around with it before, because I thought it's basically the end of the podcast, because you could just upload a paper and go, right, just discuss the paper. Just record some samples of your own voice and then you're done. So I had played around a bit before, but I think some of the other tools and the ways they used it was interesting. So Notebook LM, that's, if you've got a Google account, it will be part of one of the apps in the top right-hand corner you can get. Did you see any other sort of AI things?
Well, not really, because I after the first couple of sessions, I tried to avoid it and go and find a off. I'll be honest. Sorry, just coming back to what you were saying. Do you think then that AI in medical education will be more of using it to do the sort of long form work, the grunt work, like you say, putting in the resources that you want to summarize, or that you might collaborate for a lesson, put it in and say, come up with some questions at the end, which are better than the ones maybe you'd produce at the end of a long day resource, as opposed to, like I said, that Skynet is coming feeling where you might just be able to say, teach this group about certain rheumatological conditions and then leave the room for an hour, sort of thing. More of a useful tool than, replacement.
Yeah, I think it comes back to sort of teaching principles, doesn't it? I think if you've got the luxury of having people for an hour, 2 hours, half a day with you in a room, what are you going to spend your time doing with them? Because if it's about picking a CPD article or a paper and then summarizing it and then presenting it in some way and then adding some questions in, well, people can kind of do that for themselves now, because they could just take that paper, load it up into their own AI things and generate. You could show people how to. I think that's probably something you should show all learners how to do, because it's going to be there. It's going to be part of everyone's learning experience now. But I think if you're planning a session, I think it would give you, sometimes the first draft is the hardest thing to come up with, isn't it? And in fact, one of our colleagues who runs the regional teaching program for, I can't remember which stage of training it is, but so he will use AI to do exactly that, generate some questions for the beginning, for the end. He might probably have to catch up with him, but you could create a set of slides or some audio content that you want people to listen to beforehand. So we all know that pre-work before the session doesn't often get done, but maybe if you provided it as an audio format that people could listen to that on the drive into the teaching session, it makes it more likely that people will engage. Yeah, I do think it's going to make planning teaching sessions a bit easier. We might actually try it for some of the ideas that we had. So we may sort of do that and just say, well, if I was going to deliver a session to this many people for this long, what's the sort of key things you'd want to get across? How might you do that? You need to have an idea of what makes for effective learning, because if we're talking about just presenting information, then I'm not sure you're adding any value. Personally, I think it's a starting point, and then you can tweak things after that. That's my feeling, anyway. But yeah, maybe we should sort of try to, if you're listening and you're out there and you're using AI, then maybe send us an email. links in the show notes. Tell us how you're using it. You can share that around. Maybe we'll do an episode where we'll talk to lots of people about, or read out how people are using it within our community, so that everyone out, other people have got ideas on how to move forward with it.
Crowdfund that idea then of how are people using it and how can it be used, rather than this fear of it is being used sort of thing. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm conscious of time. I think we've covered the main bits that we wanted to. I think, well, you're involved with quite a bit of simulations. Were there any sim sessions you went to sort of see what was going on in sim?
Yeah, the sim session sort of came into the debriefing and feedback one that I was talking about at the very beginning. One of the interesting sessions I did go to that was based within simulation was looking at stress in learning. And one of the principles that we always talk about on our exploring the primary course is that the idea of a struggle and stress generating learning and sort of development skills. Obviously, stress is very prevalent in simulation. Everybody feels stressed when they go into that little box with the plastic mannequin with all the cameras watching them. It was not really a fully formed idea, but one thing did is they put heart rate straps on the participants and then looked at pulse rate variability. The idea is that as you get more stressed, your heart rate increases, but the gaps between your PR intervals, the variability in that decreases as you increase stress. So it's not just an increase in heart rate, it's a increase of regularity in the pulse. And that is a very good, actually quite well evidence-based measure of stress in medicine. And what they found is that they put them on heart rate straps on participants, and they found that the stressful bits were the briefing at the beginning when you're told the scenario. And then they simulated it so they had to walk to the ward as you would do in a normal environment. And then handover from the ward team was stressful, assessment was stressful, and handing over to the senior was more stressful as well. But what they found, and I think a lot of clinical clinicians know this, is that the walking to the simulation was the calmest bit. So it's the point of lowest stress. I think we sometimes see that, don't we, we always see that when you take a deep breath when you're walking down to resus, for instance, at the Royal Infirmary. It's a long corridor, it gives you time to get your thoughts together, and that just brings your stress levels down before it peaks back up before you go into that clinical environment. And then they sort of said, well, if this is the period of lowest stress, this is the period you need to introduce stress relieving techniques. So things like box breathing, or working through what you're going to do in your head, or simulating what you're going to do in your mind. I thought that was a really interesting sort of practical technique in simulations of measuring people's sort of heart rate variability and their stress as they went through it.
Yeah.
It would probably have to form a longer simulation thing. So you might have to do it in the morning and then do the maths over the day. And then at the end of it, you could talk about stress at the end of a stress simulation and how it affects you and where the peaks are. I know from personal experience, I've had a heart rate strap on during a list at work, and there were definite peaks during induction of stress. And I didn't feel stressed. It was quite a straightforward routine day Casey list. Non-stressful environment for me, but the heart rate variability and the stress levels obviously did peak.
Right.
I thought in terms of simulation, going from this idea of, you can go in and practice a drill or a consultation, to the bigger meta picture of thinking about when you're stressed and how you can manage that stress within not only the simulation, but in real life as well. Quite interesting as a sort of kernel of a beginning of an idea.
Yeah.
You can see that being the end of a simulation session. At the end of a sim session, everyone's quite glad to go home because they've all been recorded, and they just want it over because it is a stressful environment. But you could do that as a sort of end of the day. This is where your stresses are. We've actually measured it. We've shown it in a physical response, and then maybe give people stress management techniques to go away with.
Interesting. Yeah, you could almost see how you can almost tailor your support for individuals in different environments, couldn't you? And we're gonna measure you in paediatric theatres, or we're gonna measure you on the ward, on the ITU handover. I always found that very stressful. Or the board round, or a ward round with a certain individual. We could measure your stress levels during these situations, and then you could have your own sort of subjective kind of data collection on some questions and that, and then potentially say, these are the points where, so first step is recognizing when those things are happening, isn't it? And once you've recognized them, you can then go, I'm in one of these moments. Maybe this is a strategy I can then implement the next time that I'm in those situations. So yeah, that's sort of really an interesting idea about tailoring support, tailoring training for individuals. If we ever get the capacity to do that, maybe, but it could be a learner-driven thing,
Yeah, and that's why I think bringing it into maybe a simulation session that's done in the future, just as an idea of something to think about, it's valuable. would be difficult for us to put heart rate straps on every single learner in our department and
Yes.
tell them that they're most stressed by theatre 9 and they're least stressed by theatre 13.
Yeah.
That would be difficult. This is a debrief talk I give. You can't teach debrief in 45 minutes in a sim day, but you can give people something to think about, I think. And that's what that stress session gave me a good example of. That example I gave, I didn't feel stressed at all. That was just my routine day. But obviously my body was under stress during those straightforward tonsillectomy inductions. And
Yeah.
therefore into the whole idea of, things like clean cockpit, reducing distractions, all those things that we teach during simulation. Still relevant when you're doing a list that's just a routine sort of thing or a clinic that's a routine thing, etc.
Yeah. Interesting that if your body's reacting as if it's stressed, but you don't feel mentally that you're stressed, whether there's a kind of correlation between the two and the validity of because essentially it's a surrogate marker of stress, isn't it? So you're trying to measure stress as objectively as possible. Whereas, if you're not feeling that stressed, then don't know which one's right, which one needs more attention. Don't know. But it's this was definitely something to reflect on as a learner if you sort of if that was brought to your attention. Great. So that's one idea going forward then. So we're going to put straps on all our learners, to record all their anthropometric data and have charts on the wall. It's going to be a proper
Cycling for plenty of heart rate straps. So
dystopian future. Well, we certainly came away from the conference. That's part of the thing of these conferences, isn't it? Hearing what other people are doing and getting ideas. And certainly we have fellows in anaesthesia. We've got fellows in the Department of Education, and it's sometimes you come away with some ideas on projects that might be interesting for them to do some work. The scholarship aspect of those fellowships is about looking at these ideas and seeing whether something holds true in the environments that we work in. So we've definitely got some ideas for projects, but also, how we can, so one of my roles is in faculty development. So, what can we do to improve the knowledge and skills of our faculty delivering training? So, and we've certainly discussed some ideas about, how can we deliver some regular CPD for some of these topics that people won't get exposed to for some time, but they are always at those education conferences, because not everyone goes to these sorts of things. So we've definitely got some ideas about how to bring that to the clinicians that we work with, which we'll be looking into in the next few weeks and months. And there's a lot of talk about a fringe abstract, possibly over 1 or 2 glasses of wine. So I'm not sure whether that's actually going to come to fruition. I think I had a similar conversation last year and we didn't end up on the fringe stage. So those of you who don't know, fringe is one of the sessions at AMEE conference. There's usually 2. There was only 1 this year. It's called the Fringe, and it is, well, it's not my cup of tea, but some people really do love it. Well, a lot of people do, because it's usually packed. So I had to catch up on the video replays on the app this time round. But you got some ideas. What are you going to be planning for next year?
The idea that we came up with, like we say, over a couple of very nice glasses of red wine, was a rap battle. So you could do, learner versus educator. You could do the stresses of making errors in error-based learning sort of thing.
Yeah.
Or back and forth. I think we even used a popular large language model to come up with some rhymes for us as well. I think that was a fun idea, but whether or not it'll actually come to fruition, we might have to wear masks on stage if we're doing that, so people can look us in the eyeballs afterwards. A bit different to the normal poetry yoga that they have.
Yeah, so the sessions this year there was poetry, there was dance. So this is really about people using these methods, usually more artistic methods, in delivering education or bringing awareness to certain issues and topics. Some of them are quite, important topics and issues. So we do sort of, it's like I say, it's not for everyone, but.
And you laugh at the Hamilton musical has massively increased national knowledge about the American War of Independence. So there is
good point.
Something there.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with a bit of art, a bit of fun in learning. Why not?
Definitely, yeah. I'll see you on the stage next year then. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm just going to get AI to do it for me. In fact, I'll just create a video with my face on it and that'll be done. Good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dave, for joining me. It's worth knowing that AMEE in 2026 is going to be held in Vienna. Again, it's, Vienna. I've been to an AMEE in Vienna. In fact, that was your first one, wasn't it, Dave?
Yes, it was, yeah.
It was, wasn't it? So, Vienna, lovely city. What to say? Centre of the Habsburg Empire, so lots of lovely architecture, lovely cafe culture, and there is a great big permanent fairgrounds fair in the city centre.
High drop ride that takes you all the way up to the top. The view is beautiful. for about 7 seconds.
Yes, before your heart ends up in your mouth as you fall to the ground very rapidly, as I remember last time, thinking I was going to die. But yes, no, Vienna will be a lovely city in the middle of summer. So abstracts for that are usually January, February for AMEE. So it's quite a lead-in time. There are, I'd imagine there are hundreds of thousands of abstracts they have to sift through. So yeah, if you're interested in presenting, do get your abstracts in around the January, February time, and it would be nice to see you in Vienna if we can get the funds to go. We shall see. Great. I think that's a wrap. Anything we've mentioned, I will try and put the links into the show notes, so you should have somewhere to go and read up about it. If there's something that isn't in those, then just contact us through the email. It's in the show notes, and we can sort of point you in the right direction. But that is pretty much it. Thank you very much, Dave.
No, thank you, and thank you for having me, Andy.
No problem. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Faculty Focus podcast. If you like the episode, please share with friends and colleagues. You can also like and subscribe to the show, and perhaps even leave a review. Clinical education can be tough, but we're stronger as a community, so if you have an idea for an episode or would like to come on and talk to us, do get in touch via email or Twitter. Details in the show notes. The Faculty Focus podcast, Community Development Showcase.